Welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. And last time we were talking about medieval policing. So in seeing as we're doing reverse order, today we're going to talk about medieval murder with a wonderful guest who's a very dear friend of ours, Annie Whitehead. Annie is a prize-winning writer, historian, and elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society and has written 4 award-winning novels set in Anglo-Saxon Mercia. She's contributed to fiction and non-fiction anthologies and written for various magazines. She has won numerous prizes for her writing. Her non-fiction books, Mercia, The Rise and Fall of a Kingdom, and Women of Power in Anglo-Saxon England, are both on my bookshelves. And her latest book is Murder in Anglo-Saxon England, Justice, Weregild, Revenge. So let's talk murder, Annie. And pronunciation. Is it Weregild or Vergild?
Oh, I've always said Weregild, but you've got me thinking now.
I'd go for Weregild.
Yeah, I just thought of it when I saw it. I thought, am I saying it right? And apparently we do this every time you come on, because I seem to remember last time we had a discussion on how to pronounce Athelflaed or Ethelfled.
Well, yeah, and I think it's Athelflaed. Only using the logic that the ash symbol is the same in Alfred and Athelstan, and they've come down to us as a hard A. So I say Athelflaed, but you know, tomato, tomato.
Yeah, Weregild, Vergild. Anyway, welcome, Annie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back.
Were there a lot of murders in Anglo-Saxon England?
The reason I started thinking about writing the book was I thought, yes, there are, because I was so aware of so many different murder stories, and some of them obviously, for the most part, untrue. But when I looked into it and I actually counted up, I think there's fewer than 100 recorded cases that I can find. So maybe not, but there are, you know, there are some really famous ones. You know, we've got King Edward the Martyr, we've got King Edmund of East Anglia, we've got the Blood Eagle, Blood Feuds, and it did feel, and especially with some of the stories, like I said, the ones that are really embellished with all this literally fantastic detail. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a look and see how many I can find, and have a look and see, you know, are they likely to be true? And there weren't as many really as I expected, when you think that I was covering 5 or 6 centuries. Is that right? I can't do my maths. From the 7th to the 11th anyway. So yeah, on the whole, perhaps it wasn't as lawless as we might first imagine.
Are some not written down because they're dealt with in communities?
I think that's very possible, because you've got this system of compensation, you know, the Weregild, that is not only the man price, which is the value that's put on your life essentially, but also smaller compensation fines that are payable for injuries. And the idea of the compensation justice system is really, we think, to stop things escalating. But of course, it's like with all news reporting, isn't it? You only hear about what people want to tell you. So, and in that sense, I don't think anything's changed over the century.
No.
Yeah. If a king gets killed, then they're going to write about it. But if it's the bloke down the road who's just a farmer, or not even a farmer, then, or a slave, a churl, then is it actually going to deserve notice? Exactly.
But you might also think that if it's not reported, it's because it wasn't happening much. On the other hand, if there are laws prescribing certain crimes, then you have to assume somebody thought there was a reason to write those laws. So
mentioning the laws, as you just said, your book covers from the 7th to the 11th century. So did the laws or attitudes to murder change across that time? Because that's an enormous span of time, isn't it?
It is, and I think maybe some people who aren't so familiar with the period would be surprised to learn that we actually have written laws from as early as the 7th century. And those laws are quite detailed. I mean, they don't cover everything, but we do get a lot of detail. And what surprised me is that there is really no death penalty for murder. It seems to be more that, you know, if you're a thief and you're caught thieving, you're going to hang. But not so much with murder, partly because of this compensation system where you're liable for this payment, or if you can't pay it, then your kin or your lord is liable for the payment. So it is a way of keeping society in check. What I found really interesting is as you go through the centuries, it's maybe not the laws that change overly much. I mean, they do get tinkered with. So King Athelstan promulgated a lot of laws and brought in changes. At one point, he had the age of culpability, I think, was 12, which seems quite barbaric. And he did, at the end, say he'd spoken to his advisors and he'd raised it to 15. And we think, oh, that's a bit better, you know, to our modern sensibilities. And then you have to remember that our age of culpability now is 10. Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're not hanging people for stealing sheep anymore, but, you know, it's not so dissimilar. But what I found really interesting is as you get further on, even though the kings seem to be more involved, there's more emphasis on the role of kingship and certainly Christian kingship. But then a lot of the later chapters in the book are taken up with murders that, you know, the kings are either turning a blind eye or they're actually ordering them done. And it's almost as if these later murders weren't considered murders. They were just something that had to be done, that was necessary in order to get rid of certain people. So that was interesting to look at how attitudes changed. But the laws, I think they just became a little bit more detailed. And towards the later period, there's a bit more emphasis in trying to damp down this idea of feud. But I'm not sure it necessarily worked.
I think feuds lasted quite a long time, until today, in fact.
Well, indeed.
So what kinds of murders are we talking about? I mean, there were political, weren't there? And
yes,
the one I always think of is, like you say, Edward the Martyr. He's the one who always springs to mind. Poor chap, you know, rides into his stepmother's castle, gets stabbed and then dragged away by his horse with his head hitting every rock.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, we get some lovely detail on that. But there's a whole range. I mean, there's assassination attempts with poisoned blades. I mean, you know, as a novelist, you
Wow,
couldn't make it up. There's regicide, there's kings killing other kings, killing their rivals sons, dragging them out of sanctuary in order to kill them. We've got women killers, and obviously Edward the Martyr, you know, you've got that classic ingredient of the wicked stepmother. And then you've got, as I mentioned, kings ordering killings. You know, the St. Brice's Day massacre that King Ethelred the Unready admitted that he'd ordered and said, you know, I ordered this thing done. And then you've got this scene almost straight out of a you'd think Hollywood invented the idea of people being locked in a church and then the church set on fire. But no, this really happened in Oxford in the 11th century. And we know that because A, the king admitted he'd ordered it done, and B, because excavation has thrown up some charred bones at the actual location, which is all a bit, you know, it makes, those are the cases that make it feel a bit more real somehow when it's the unnamed victims. And when you've got the archaeological evidence. But yeah, we've got women, nearly always when the women are accused, they're either inciting somebody else to do the murder on their behalf, they're ordering pits dug under where the victim's sitting, or we've got poison, which seems to be traditionally, and not just in this age, but right throughout, the woman's weapon of choice. And the idea is that it's maybe a little bit more hands-off. You know, they're not actually having to get too close to their victims, which makes the Edward the Martyr story all the more interesting because Alfred, his stepmother, was very, very close to him in some of the accounts. So she didn't necessarily stab him herself, but she came right up to him and she offered him a drink. And there's a famous painting of her standing very, very close to him with her henchman standing behind him with his dagger raised. So it's interesting that she has seemingly got a lot closer to her victim. But we've got all sorts. We've even got death by scissors, which is a lovely one. So yeah, absolutely anything and everything, I suppose. And then again, in that sense, it's no different from a lot of the other periods of history. But yeah, it was really fun to look into. I did enjoy it.
I mean, the thing is, you get the hall burnings idea. I think it was in the first episode of The Last Kingdom, wasn't it? Where Uhtred's adoptive father was burnt to death in a hall burning, where they closed the doors, barred it, and set it on fire.
And there are other instances of that in the sort of so-called blood feud, where actually his hall is set on fire, but then as he comes out of the burning building, then he's beheaded. So and there's a lot of the murders concern betrayal, really, which sounds obvious, but luring people out on hunting trips in order to then have them ambushed, or disregarding the hospitality rules, so attacking people in their own halls. And there's one murder that takes place very close to Christmas, and you wonder whether they were actually celebrating Christmas feast and just then attacked. And obviously, if they're sitting down to a meal or in the hall, then they're not necessarily got their weapons close by. So yeah, it's all a bit grim. But I said that the death by scissors, I mean, that's, it's quite an amusing story, that one. So there's the whole range, it runs the whole gamut.
No, come on, you're going to have to explain the death by scissors.
Yeah. Death by scissors, it's one of my favourites. It actually does go slightly out of the Anglo-Saxon period, but I couldn't not include it. So it's Walter, the Bishop of Hereford, and he's obviously got a bit of a reputation because his eye is taken by a local seamstress, and he needs some. I can't remember what he actually needs sewing, whether it's his own garments, but the seamstress comes to his rooms. His staff and his servants apparently seem to know that he can't be trusted to be left alone with this woman.
Sorry, when you just said his eye was taken by a seamstress, I was ahead of the game there. I thought she's had his eye out.
I was going to say she caught his eye, but that's no better, is it?
No, it's no help. Sorry, carry on. No.
Yeah, so he sends all his servants away. They clearly know that he's not to be trusted, and he obviously lunges at her. And fortunately for her, she happens to have a pair of her sewing scissors to hand, and she stabs him in the groin. And you think that's going to stop him. But what I love about this, and it's such a good example of how the early stories compare with the later stories. So this story comes to us from our good friend William of Malmesbury, the incorrigible gossip, and he actually said that the king did not want this story spread. And I thought, well, it got as far as your ears, William, and you've written it down for posterity. So, but it's this lovely idea. The number of the Anglo-Norman chroniclers who give us all this delicious detail, and some of them do claim to be using earlier sources, but a lot of the detail you can dismiss it immediately. But it's great, for writing fiction. That's where you get all the lovely juicy details. But they do say things which, frankly, and especially if you've got, A, your historian head on, but B, you're fancying yourself as a bit of a detective, as I did. This idea, you think, how did you know this? It's not necessarily relevant, but the example that always comes to my mind is the one about Lady Athelflaed, who's the reason she didn't have any more children was because that she was determined to be chaste from then on. And you think, who was she telling that centuries later William of Malmesbury or Henry of Huntingdon knew this story? I mean, I'm surprised if she even told her husband of a decision like that, never mind anyone else, So you have to be very, very cautious. But death by scissors, I absolutely love that story. And I just think and also it wasn't really murder. In my view, that's manslaughter, that's self-defense.
Yes. And you can tell what he was trying to do by where he was wounded.
Exactly.
but he was a bishop, so you can also understand why it was ordered, if it was so, that the story shouldn't be spread around, because
indeed, yes,
nobody wants it known that you can kill a bishop.
yeah,
Or an archbishop or a king or a noble.
yeah.
It damages the natural order of things.
I think men generally wouldn't want it too well known that you could be stabbed in the groin and die. But
yes, and by a woman.
Right, this thing, the blood eagle,
Oh,
which appears in lots of literary sources, and which I'm told is anatomically
it
possible.
is.
But did it really exist? Was it done?
Well, here's the thing. So it has been researched, and it would be possible. And it would be possible to keep the victim alive for most of the process, which is horrific. I've got a description here. So the victim is restrained.
I was afraid you would have.
I was hoping.
Is restrained. You'd have to restrain them, wouldn't you? I mean, and then they'd have the shape of an eagle with outstretched wings cut into their back. Then their ribs would be cut from the spine, and the bones, and I'm sorry if anyone's eating while they're listening to this, and the bones and skin pulled out until they resembled the shape of wings. The victim would still be alive at this point and would literally have salt rubbed into their wounds. And then the lungs were pulled out and spread over the wings to create an image of a fluttering as the victim then finally dies. But that description mainly comes from much, much later sources in the 19th century. And the early one, we've got an 11th century verse. I mean, I can have a go at trying to read it. Old Norse is not very good. Ok elu bak at let hins sat Ivar ara Jorvik skorit.
So it happened at York.
Yes, if it happened at all. And this is obviously the revenge taken by Ivar against King Ella of Northumbria, who allegedly threw Ragnar into the snake pit. Which we can also say, snakes, England, we've only got adders. And then, you know.
Yeah, but I've seen the film, Vikings. I've seen that happen.
Oh, well. So one translation.
You could have got a lot of adders.
Yeah, well, indeed, yeah. And they can be quite dopey. You'd have to get them at the right time of year. And even then, an adder bite's not always fatal.
No, exactly.
So, and we don't even know if Ragnar existed, but certainly his sons did. And the translation, well, we've got two translations of that verse, actually. One is, and Ivar, he who resided in York, had Allah's back cut by/with an eagle/sword. So we're not entirely sure. And another translation is, and Allah's back at had the one who dwelt Ivar with eagle York cut. So it mentions cutting. It mentions an eagle. There's another, I think it's also 11th century source that talks about the back being cut, albeit deeply. But whether the actual blood eagle, that, you know, the story that comes to us by the 19th century, whether that's true or not, we don't know. But it's a really good example of how, you know, you go back to the earliest sources. They may not always be contemporary, but they're not giving the same gory, gruesome detail. Either because they're not interested and it's just one of the mill every day, or it's not true, you know? And that's the thing. And it's, you have to balance the two. And I suspect the truth often is somewhere in between, as you know, often.
But we don't have any archaeological evidence of such a thing. There's no bodies being found like that. I mean, if there was,
there is the image of the stone that's actually on the front cover of the book that does look like somebody having their back attacked with an axe, but it's not a depiction of how we think of as the blood eagle.
Are there any Saxon sources that refer to it, or is it all Norse?
No.
You think, wouldn't you, that if that was done to a Saxon, there would be Saxon sources that would be ranting about it and complaining and outrage and all the rest of it?
Well, in some sources, and I can't remember off the back of my head whether these were Saxon sources or Norse. I think they're probably Saxon. He didn't have a fantastic reputation. There's one story about him raping one of his men's wives, or stealing one of their wives and marrying them himself. So, but again, I think I'd have to go back and look at my own book. I think the idea behind that, to trash his reputation, was to sort of justify the killing, which again is so often the case, that you really do have to do a lot of detective work and say, you know, did this happen, and did it happen the way we're being told it happened, or is there another reason? You know, why are we being told the story this way? You know, this idea that Ragnar Lothbrok might never even have existed, but the idea is that he exists in the sagas purely to show how heroic his sons were in avenging his death, even though he might, I mean, obviously they had a father, but it might not have been him, you know. So it's really difficult, because even when you think you've got a solid contemporary source, you've still got to think about the motives for what they're writing, and indeed what they're not writing. Again, it just goes back to this idea of, you know, news editors. What do we decide to tell the public? You know, it's just so much fun to look into all. And you do need a strong stomach for some of it, and always remembering that, you know, we are talking about real people and real murder victims, and as I said earlier, it's those unnamed victims, I think, when bones are turned up, that you realise, you know, it's more moving, I think, than just reading about kings who were killing other kings, because perhaps they probably didn't even really, or they wouldn't want our sympathy, because that to them was the way they lived their lives. I think it's more the genuinely innocent victims where it makes you pause for a moment or two.
Definitely. So you were saying not many people got hanged for murder or executed. What were the punishments then?
Hanging, definitely. We know there were gallows. In the execution cemeteries, we do find a lot of decapitated bodies. And I did chat to a specialist about how easy that might be to do. The answer is not. It's not that easy to lop someone's head off, even if you're practiced at the art. As we know, you know, from the more famously the Tudor executions were famously botched, weren't they, a lot of the time? You might get banished, you might get exiled. That would be more probably on the king's discretion, but by and large you're not getting killed for murder. There's no sense of capital punishment. If you're breaking the king's peace, or you're violating the king's peace, if you're attacking someone on the royal land, there's more likely to be a more severe punishment. But by and large, it's the weregild that's due. And some kings had to pay weregild. Famously, we've got a couple of examples from the 7th century where they weren't paying in money, but they had to pay by having abbeys and churches built, and then ordering prayers said daily for their victims. So we've got a couple of high-profile cases of those, one of which we know about from Bede. And obviously, again, Bede, Northumbrian monk, he's writing his ecclesiastical history, so he's going to tell us things like that. But by and large, no. As I said earlier, if you're a thief and you get caught, you're going to hang. But murder's not so much. And the really famous cases, certainly in the late 10th, early 11th century, you know, the kings are getting away with murder, the nobles are getting away with murder. The laws are probably not as robust as they seem, because we do have a couple of high-profile law cases. And there's a wonderful one where, and it just shows the attitude. A, the law is clearly not working. And B, you can see where the interest lies. There's this a sort of middle-ranking nobleman who kept stealing his neighbour's land, essentially. And he kept getting told to give it back. And he kept taking it again. And I think it was about 3 times that his case came up. And so clearly it shows, you know, he's really thumbing his nose at the law and ultimately at the king. But then it got a bit messy because his wife got involved, gathered up a posse of her relatives, went over to this neighbouring land and slaughtered everybody there. Well, we are not told what happened to her. It's almost as if we don't mind that she killed all these people. What we mind is that this man is stealing land.
Yes.
You know,
Well,
it's all about property and theft of
Yes.
property. And I just thought that's really, really interesting. And it does show that the law was not necessarily that robust, because it wasn't putting him off. But also, nobody seemed to think it was important to write down whether this woman was even punished for this mass murder. So yeah, really, really interesting when you do find these nuggets, and I just wish there was more.
Yeah.
But, sadly, we have to work with what we've got.
I mean, we've discussed this before, haven't we, Derek, that the priority was land and inheritance rather than lives.
That goes right the way through the whole period.
Yeah, it does. It does.
And I mean, even today, the Wergild obviously is the precursor to the modern compensation system. And I remember when I was at university, I did law for 2 years, and there were these set prices based on the value of body parts and things like that. So I'm guessing that there were there set prices in the Wergild, or was it negotiated?
No, they were set, and they were laid out in the laws. Obviously, they varied from king to king and kingdom to kingdom and century to century, but they were laid out, and they were so specific that the thinking has to be that they were really designed to stop these things happening. It's a deterrent rather than a punishment. But it's if you damage one eye or you damage two, if an ear is wounded or if it's fully removed, then the payments are different, and it can be as much as I think I haven't got the figures in front of me, but if you damage one ear, it's, I don't know, say 2 shillings. If you damage both, it's 6 shillings. And it goes from tiny little things. Whether a bruise, you will pay if you bruise someone, but you'll pay more if that bruise is visible through their clothing, which I'm trying to think how a bruise could actually be visible through clothing.
I suppose if it's on the face.
Indeed. And it's, like I say, whether an eye is damaged or whether it's actually gouged out, whether an arm is bruised or actually broken, whether a limb is severed, and it goes right through. And you think this is ridiculously detailed, but obviously it is designed to say, this is the law. If you do this, you will get punished, and this is what you will have to pay. And more importantly, I think the idea that the Lord and or the kin are responsible. It's like, if the bailiffs come after you and they find that you've got nothing in your house, they're going to go to your dad's house or your brother and take his flat screen TV. Then he's going to say to you, "Oi, will you stop doing this? Because you're costing me money. You're damaging our reputation." And so the idea is that kin will reject the perpetrator, and the idea is that everything will not escalate, it will calm down. And I think, judging by how few cases we hear of, we might assume that it was successful by and large. But then this chap who kept stealing land, obviously people were able to break the law with impunity. So
yeah, I suppose it's like you look in your purse and think, well, how much can I afford? He's upset me. Can I go and cut out his eye, or should I just bruise the chap?
I hadn't thought of that, but
Presumably it must have arisen, though, from a need. There must have been sufficient lawlessness at some point to suggest that they needed a deterrent. They needed a way to prevent it.
Yeah.
So do we know anything about the origins of Wergild? Or
the only thing that we think we know is that these laws, as I said earlier, are from the 7th century by and large, and most of the later laws are just built on those. The idea being that these were things that were not written down but were practiced in the Germanic society. So whether it was all brought across when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Frisians and all the rest came over, and also the laws were only written down as the kings converted to Christianity. And then you've got literacy, and then you've got things being written down. But it does sound very much like a sort of Germanic warrior society way of dealing with things. And obviously, I love the era. I think it's a lot more sophisticated than people might perhaps imagine. But, it was a warrior society. It was violent. society remained very violent for hundreds of years afterwards. So it's not surprising probably that the easiest way to sort out an argument, with your neighbour was probably with your fists, or a dagger secreted about your person. So it is easy to see how violence flared up and how they would want to control that. And it was probably a question of you knew. And then I suppose even after the laws were written down, out in the villages and the settlements, people wouldn't necessarily be aware that these things had been written down. But I think they would still be aware that as a concept, it existed. They would have been aware of their rights and their responsibilities, and also what they weren't allowed to do.
I think you're right about a warrior society, because in a warrior society, you need them to be warriors. You need them to be fierce. You need them to be violent, because you're utilizing them as a means of control and against your rivals.
Yeah.
So you don't want to calm them down too much, but you want to control that violence. And the Wergild sounds like a really good way of doing it.
Yeah. It's not unique to the English kingdoms. The Welsh early medieval society had something very, very similar, and the name of it escapes me. So it's a common concept. It's not unique to the Angles and the Saxons. And, again, that makes you think that it worked. By and large, it worked, or people thought it was a good system, or they hadn't come up with a better one. So, yeah, it's like you say, you do need people to, they need to be able to kill when you want them to. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Was it sexist as well, though? Was their value placed higher on a man's life than a woman's life in the Wergild?
I wish I could tell you, but I can't. So that probably gives you your answer, doesn't it? The only real time that the women's worth is mentioned, I'm afraid, is in relation to if you happen to violate another man's slave. And it's a slave woman. It depends on whether, it sounds horrible because it is, but there were various classes of slave even. So, it depends. If you, and I do say that Anglo-Saxon women had many, many more rights, freedoms and privileges than their later medieval counterparts. But it does still seem to be the case with the law codes. Yes, you will be punished if you do something you shouldn't to another man's wife, but you're paying him. You're not paying her.
Yeah.
That's the difference. So she is, I suppose, again, everything is done in terms of the value of property. So if you render my slave useless because you've raped her and you've got her pregnant or worse, then I want compensating for that, because that's affecting my household. And if you damage my wife, you've damaged my goods. It does seem to have an element of that. But as I say, the Anglo-Saxon women, noble women, had lots more freedoms and privileges that the later medieval women perhaps didn't. But no, there's nothing specific about the women. They're not being treated equally in the eyes of the law. Well, they are, but not for the same reason, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned Edward the Martyr before. Is that the most celebrated Anglo-Saxon murderer, or are there others that stand out?
Yeah, as we were chatting about, Edward the Martyr is such a great case because it's got so many wonderful elements. I mean, also an element of farce, because in one of the versions he gets his foot caught in the stirrup and he's being dragged, and you've got the wicked stepmother and the little baby brother who may or may not have known what was going on. So there's I think also I think I mentioned it before, King Edmund of East Anglia. I think that's quite a good one, because I think a lot of people have heard of St Edmund, even if they don't know his story. But again, we've got all these lovely elements where his decapitated head told the searchers who were looking for him where the body could be found, and the head had been protected by a wolf. And then later on, as with a lot of decapitated murder victims, if there's any sainthood being conferred on them, often when the tombs or coffins are opened up, it seems miraculously the head has been joined to the body and there's just a thin red line. That's a story that comes up time and time again, and that it does feature in Edmund's story. I don't know. I think, yeah, the celebrated ones, I think probably most people have heard of Edward the Martyr, and I suppose his epithet is a bit of a giveaway. Yeah, King Edmund of East Anglia, I think that's quite a famous one, and obviously, you know, a lot of people today still think that he should be our patron saint rather than St George. So he's got that going for him.
And there's one, isn't there? Sigurd and Morcar, I think are the names, who were murdered by, is it Edric Striona?
Oh, yes.
And then Edmund Ironside rescued the wife and married her.
I mean, I do have to wonder how she felt about that.
Yeah.
But it does seem that they weren't strangers, because they were all part of this sort of court faction. So there's Edmund Ironside and Seaforth and Morcar, and the families were, you know, really well known to each other. And Edmund's elder brother Athelstan had left gifts to Seaforth and Morcar in his will. So you can imagine this sort of group of youths at court, and you know, she probably would have known Edmund as a friend of her husband's. Quite why she was in prison, we're never really told. We can only assume that Athelred was just a bit paranoid at this point, and you know, his eldest surviving son is, I don't know, I think sort of nipping at his heels a little bit and thinking, well, my dad's married again, he's married Emma of Normandy, she's got sons by him now, it's time for me to make a stand. So I think there was probably an element of that. But yeah, we're just told that, you know, the Thanes, Seaforth and Morcar, were killed, and the wife was locked up, and Edmund valiantly rescued her and married her. And, you know, we're told to sort of, it's almost like we're being misdirected. And we shouldn't be looking at the fact that he gained so much land and power because as a widow, she brought all her husband's retainers and men to his cause. And the land, again, you know, we're talking about property. So she was a very, very valuable widow. And I might be being really cynical, you know, they might have, I don't know, for all I know, they might have been having an affair under her husband's nose, and it was just quite convenient that he got deaded and taken out of the picture. But I think on balance, it was probably just a very, very shrewd move on Edmund's part to marry her. But maybe also to show his dad, you know, this is what I can do. I can get your prisoners out of prison. You know, don't underestimate what I'm about to do.
You've got that romantic angle, haven't you, where he went to his dad and said, oh, I want to marry her, and dad locks her up instead. You're not marrying her. Poor Edmund. I'll show dad, I'll rescue her. Edric Striona's there. I'll just kill everybody. That's just fun.
Who would you like me to kill next, boss?
Yeah. He's really, Edric Striona is just one of those who, I don't know, he just seems to be the, you know, he's the biggest, Marvel would just have a great time with him because he's just the biggest villain of the 11th century, isn't he? Wherever he goes, he betrays everybody, he kills people.
He does, and at some point, you know, he does back himself into a corner when he's sort of upset everybody he can think of upsetting, and then still has to pick a side. You know, and one minute he's fighting for Canute, and the next minute he's trying to be friends with Edmund Ironside. But it's really, really impossible to feel any sympathy for him. And I've tried, and much, much greater historians than I have also tried to sort of restore his reputation.
Rehabilitate,
yeah. And it's impossible.
Yeah.
There are no mitigating circumstances.
The only surprise is how come he survived so long? Because he betrayed people numerous times and they still forgave him.
Yeah.
He must have been very charismatic.
I was going to say he had the protection of Athelred the Unready for a long time, and he was doing the king's dirty work. I mean, he was married to the king's daughter as well. So that maybe gave him a fair amount of protection. And then, of course, he seemed to have this knack of managing to be on the winning side a lot of the time. So I think he was very shrewd, and then ultimately just, I don't know, overreached. I think. I mean, we've got no solid evidence that he or his family were connected with Edmund Ironside's death. It may be that Edmund Ironside just died of battle wounds, which they don't, the Anglo-Saxon writers don't seem to talk very much about death by battle wounds. They don't necessarily make that connection. And I did look into it a little bit in the book to see if they understood that idea. And there is something, it's King Clothaire of Kent. Bede talks about how he was badly wounded in battle and then died, but it's still not entirely clear whether they were making that solid connection between, the wounds in battle and then dying, unless the wounds killed them immediately. I have to assume that they knew, this man's had his guts ripped open, he is going to die, and that's what's going to make him die. But they don't actually talk about it. And there are a number of cases where you can look and think, that man was in a battle and died less than, a month later or 6 months later. And you do wonder whether that was the cause, even if the wounds aren't killing them immediately and they're not in any immediate danger. As we know, sometimes injuries can take months to finish you off, but they don't seem to talk about it.
And injuries can lead to sort of secondary problems anyway that aren't directly the result of the wound, but they cause other illnesses and things to happen.
And whether they understood that, I'm not sure.
No, I don't think they did.
It doesn't sound as good though as a spear up the bum, does it?
No, it doesn't. And then again, you think, that the Game of Thrones, that famous scene where Tywin Lannister is killed while he's, on the loo.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, that's just an invention for the teleseries. But no, it may not have happened to Edmund Ironside, but the fact that they wrote that it did, there's just nothing new under the sun, really.
No. So we know what your favourite murder is, which is the Bishop of Hereford and a scissor to the nether regions. What's the strangest murder story you came across?
I mean, there's some that you just find difficult to believe. And this is also one of my favourites. And I do tell it a lot because, again, it's got all the elements you would want. And it's a classic case of the Anglo-Norman chroniclers getting carried away with themselves. But it's the lovely story of the murder of little Kenelm, or Cunahelm, who was the son of a king of Mercia. And apparently his older adult sister was very, very jealous when he succeeded their father. And straight away, she had no reason to assume that he wouldn't. Women did not inherit kingdoms, so there would be no expectation there. But anyway, apparently she was extremely upset by this. And again, we've got this classic scenario where she gets a henchman to persuade her little brother to go out. I'm not sure whether they're hunting or whether they're walking in the woods. But anyway, he doesn't make it out of the woods alive. And all would be fine, except that in some stories, it's just a dove flies over the altar of St. Peter's in Rome. And in other stories, it's actually the soul of little Kenelm that leaves his body in the form of a dove. But anyway, the dove drops a message on the altar in Rome, so quite a long way away from Mercia, saying what's happened. And we're not told how the message actually gets back to England. But they find the little body and there's a funeral procession and it comes back to the abbey where his evil murdering sister is actually abbess. She sees them out of the window. She's reading from a psalter. She starts chanting the psalm backwards as a kind of a spell to avoid discovery, whereupon her eyeballs fall out. And again, this part of the story comes to us from William of Malmesbury, our old friend. And he said that when he was writing, a couple of centuries later, you could still see the bloodstains on the psalter, even in his day. And it's a fantastic story. It's got all the elements. It's got, the luring into the woods. It's got the often a case that we find that the dead bodies or the victims are able to communicate somehow in some form, or there's a white light that shines, showing where the body's buried or hidden. But we've also got the fact that when you actually look at the contemporary evidence, we look at the charters that were issued during their father, King Kenwulf's reign. There is a man called Cunohelm witnessing some of these charters during their father's lifetime. It's not entirely clear whether he is the king's son. He does seem to be an adult, and he does seem to have predeceased his father. So almost all of the elements of this story are not true. And I love it because it really encapsulates what we've got going on, the difference between the contemporary sources and the later sources. You've got the element of the fantastic, which of course, to people who really strongly believed, really had Christian faith, these things mattered. The miracles associated with these murdered kings who 9 times out of 10 became saints, that really mattered as well.
Yeah.
But then you've got this disparity between the sources. And in this case, it's great because we can actually find the contemporary evidence to say, actually, it didn't happen. So then you say, why? Why are we getting this story? And oftentimes, this particular abbess was, not only was she abbess of Winchcombe, where this is all supposed to have happened, she was also in charge of really big, lucrative abbeys in Kent. And she locked horns with the Archdiocese of Canterbury. And, and she's not the only one who did that. And then finds her reputation trashed by the later chroniclers. And we have to remember that, as Matt Lewis actually said in his book about Eleanor and Henry II, that church attitudes in the 12th century really changed towards women. Yeah. So we've got that going on. And we've also got the fact that they've argued with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they're being written about by monks who have no cause to, big up these women. So yeah, that's one of the strangest stories because it's weird.
And of course, the eyes popping out, that's one of their great examples of moral judgment, isn't it?
That also is a trope. I mean, she's far from the only one. The eyeballs seem to fall out a lot in this.
Well, you get it in Lady Godiva's story, don't you? Peeping Tom gets his eyeballs popping off and then drops dead just to be sure.
And eyes are a big thing because there's also an awful lot of episodes of willful blinding. This is a really nasty but effective way of taking out your rivals. And often they didn't survive. Either we're not told what other injuries were inflicted on them at the time, because again, the only thing we're told is the blinding, because that's what's important to these storytellers. That's the significant thing. They might also have had their knuckles smashed or their ankles broken, or they might have been kneecapped, but that's not important because that's not part of the morality.
There's another one as well.
We'll not mention that. The moral side of it.
Because Derek's here.
It's so symbolic, isn't it, that this person was rendered absolutely useless and ineffective because their eyes were taken. It's so significant and so symbolic. It may be that that's a really nasty injury, and if you're just left to bleed, then you might bleed out. But that's what we're told. It's the blinding, So it's all about the eyes, isn't it? It's a bit squishy and gruesome.
It's interesting what you're saying about the fantastic elements being important to people of the time, because the problem for us in a modern age is taking seriously things which were taken seriously at the time. So reality for us is completely different from reality in, say, the 9th century or something, because what people believed to be true, believed it to their core, we know isn't true. But it doesn't matter that we know it isn't true, because at the time that these things happened, the reality was they were true.
Yes, absolutely. And you can think of a more modern example that just proves exactly what you've just said when you think about what went on with the Salem witch trials.
Yeah.
It does seem that these women and girls really believed that this was happening. And you see that the testimony firsthand, and it looks like, and it was really happening. The reasons why people were having what we would probably describe now as fits. But they saw it, they believed it, and they believed why it was happening. So you can imagine back in the early days, I mean, again, Edward the Martyr, his little baby brother, Ethelred the Unready, might not have known about that murder being committed on his behalf at the time, but he certainly knew that he benefited from it. And it was he who actually encouraged the cult, of Saint Edward. But it's the everyday people who are reporting the miracles. And it's so easy to say, and it genuinely could have happened that somebody might have gone to visit a shrine, started to feel better.
Yeah.
And then these stories grow. But they would absolutely have believed it themselves. And then, and the mind is such a powerful thing. Well, if my friend felt better when they went, perhaps I will too. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and dismiss anybody's faith or beliefs, but you can see how it would happen and how, as you said, how important it was to them, because they really, really did believe these things. Yeah. I think the people out in the villages and the communities were probably, I don't know, I'd like to think perhaps more committed to their faith in some ways. I think with a lot of the nobility, especially as we get towards the end of the period, there is a lot of cynicism. And we have to remember that if you had a murdered royal saint in your family, that's a good thing, because it gets the pilgrims in, it fills the coffers, it enhances your reputation. So, it's very, very sad that so-and-so got killed, but, we can do something about this. It's, I'm not saying they didn't grieve, but they did seem to turn it to their advantage a lot of times.
Yeah, it's good for Ethelred that he was under 10 at the time of his brother's murder, because he couldn't be blamed for it. If he'd, if it was 10 years later and Edward had been murdered.
Yes, but nobody ever did get punished for it.
Yeah.
There was a lot of finger pointing, again, more by the later sources, but nobody was, and they should have been. There should have been, it was the responsibility of the family to find, who carried out the murder, but nobody did. They got away with it.
I think that's probably why a lot of the sources decided it was Elfrith, because nobody got punished. It must have been the king's mother.
Yes, yeah. And again, and she had a terrible reputation.
Well, she was a woman for starters.
She was a woman. She was a powerful woman. She was a consecrated queen. But again, there's ludicrous stories about her being found cavorting with horses and practicing witchcraft. And the abbot who found her, she then ordered him murdered by having he was stabbed in his armpits where the wounds wouldn't show. Again, you think, well, anybody dressing the body afterwards would have probably noticed. But, and again, the assumption that she was somehow involved or complicit in the murder of her stepson. But we do have contemporary evidence that she was speaking on other women in legal cases. She was a forestbreaker, a forespeaker. For women who were bringing lawsuits, and that that's a classic example of one of the powers of Anglo-Saxon women. They were able to bring lawsuits for their own, he's pinched my land and I want it back kind of thing, and the men didn't have to speak for them. And she was also remembered in the Regularis Concordia, which was the rule book for the Benedictine way of life. One of the bishops who supported her throughout actually named her as, I think, did you call it the sentinel, looking after all the nuns? This is the woman who has got the, a bit like our monks today, the keeper of the faith. She was named as being that for all the Benedictine nuns. So it's, and again, you think this is a man who knew her. If he thought she was capable of murder, of poison, of witchcraft, I'm not so sure he would have said, you look after all these nuns, you be the sort of colonel in chief of the Benedictine order. So yeah, I think she had a really, really bad press, but I don't know who did do it. 9 times out of 10, I think, no, it wasn't you, it was you, wasn't it? But with this case, I'm really not sure. Or whether she just went, oh, my men are acting on their own initiative. Oh, hey ho, that's sad. Never mind, let's move on. You know,
Yeah. Won't someone rid me of this turbulent stepson who's king?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, what are you working on now then? What can you tell us what you're doing now?
Yeah, it's a novel that I started, and then I got sidetracked by this idea of collecting all these murder stories. So I've just sort of blown the dust off it and started working on it again. It's set in the 10th century, and it's got some Vikings, it's got Mercians, obviously, because that's who I write about. There are a couple of murders. So, but it's just, I didn't get very far with it when I stopped. It was a bit like, oh, I've got an idea for a murder story, and it was like a dog, you know, oh, squirrel. So I'm just getting back into that now. And we've got a new historical fiction anthology coming out later this year. So, and those are all tales of history and mystery. So that'll be fun. I'm not sure when it's due out, sometime in the summer, I think.
Well, that's good. We'll keep an eye out for
Wonderful.
that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Annie. And I can highly recommend Murder in Anglo-Saxon England. I've only just started reading it, but I am hooked.
Thank you.
So
that's good to know.
It's murder, you know. We all say how bad it is, but we're all drawn to reading about it.
Well, that's it. As I say, we all love a good murder story.
We
and
do.
I don't think the Anglo-Saxons really, or maybe it was the Anglo-Norman chroniclers that just loved a good murder story.
Yeah.
Well, they were the great gossipers, the Anglo-Norman chroniclers. I mean, like you say, Malmesbury and Huntingdon, they just loved a good gossip. Didn't really matter if it was true.
No.
And if they could put a moral story in there at the same time, so much the better. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us, Annie.
Yeah.
It's been so lovely to chat to you again. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always such a nice time having a chat with you. Do join us next time when we'll be chatting with Catherine Warner and discussing the great, the powerful, the controversial John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can get us on all your favourite podcast providers as well as YouTube, and you can subscribe. And please, if you've got time, we'd love to have a review from you as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.